everybody. I think we're going to get started. Yeah, about that time. All right, well, thank you, everybody. It's good to see you all again. Sorry I missed last month. I was living the dream in tax life.
Recovered?
No. It'll take me another, month to recover. But anyway, all right, I believe we have a quorum. And let's go around with introductions. I'll begin. I'm Michelle Day, and a citizen at large.
Sharon Brown, represent the City of Fountain.
Jessica McMullen with PPACG. I'm your local state representative.
John DeVoe, Woodland Park.
Tom Fifely, City of Colorado Springs.
Steve Hart, City of Manitou Springs.
Roy Rosenthal.
Kevin Walker, at large.
Hal Moffett, El Paso County.
Julie Ott, League of Women Voters. Tina Meichler, at large.
Laura Nelson, El Paso County.
Tim O'Donnell, Kono.
Jim Moore, at large.
And then
Jessica Bechtel, PPACG.
And in the gallery, please. Yes, ma'am. Just
We're Ann and Jerry Ash, and we're from Green Mountain Falls. You need somebody from Green Mountain Falls, so we're going to volunteer. We haven't been approved yet, but we hope.
Get up here at the table.
Excellent.
welcome.
The table.
Excellent.
Forward to having you.
Yeah, we're thrilled with that.
And I'm Ken Prather, PPACG.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's everybody. All right, well, we have the consent agenda, consent items, the agenda minutes, and board report. Is there any discussion, any concerns? All in favor of the consent items? You'll need a motion? Or need a motion? Somebody can make a motion.
I move that we approve the consent items.
Second. Whoever.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Sounds good.
All right, consent items passed. All right, are there any public comments? No? Okay, seeing as there are none, let's move along to our action items. Ken, looks like it's up to you.
Wish I'd been here for this.
Good afternoon, Ken Prather, PPACG Acting Transportation Director.
I saw that.
TIP Amendment
Keeps them on their toes.
Transportation Improvement Program, commonly called a TIP. Amendment number 17 is the addition of 2 Safe Routes to Schools projects to our TIP. These projects were selected by CDOT. They have an annual competition, and they make the decision. The call for projects was last fall. They made their decision early this spring. They've announced the awards, and we got 2 of the awards in the state, and so now they need to be added to the TIP. So Lewis Palmer School District and the City of Woodland Park can start work.
Excellent.
Is there any discussion? Yes, Kevin.
2 out of how many?
I don't know.
It'll be quite a few.
For sure.
You just had to say something. All right.
They do have a website for the Safe Routes to Schools. The last time I looked, they did not have this year's list up on the website. They had last year's.
Is there a motion?
I move that we forward TIP Amendment 17 to the board for approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Ken. Pardon? Sharon. Okay, information items, CDOT, Michael Snow.
Well, I don't see Michael Snow, so I think I just volunteered.
Well, that was very kind of you, Ken.
Yes, thank you.
Let's see if I get the right one here.
We need F5. Here's 5.
Okay. If you remember last year, CDOT, specifically Mark Andrews, came through our committees and introduced the concept of CDOT's 10-year implementation plan. It was identified the needs within the state over the next 10 years, that projects that did not have any funding. And within that entire 10-year list, they had their Tier 1 projects, which were the priority projects that if money became available, we would do those projects first. And there were some of those projects within the state that were in the PPACG area, and we made recommendation to CDOT as to what we thought the priority projects in our region were. The CDOT Division of Transit and Rail, that's what it is, CDOT Division of Transit and Rail, is now doing the same thing with transit projects, developing this large 10-year list of projects. If money fell out of the sky, or if the legislature finally agreed on something, that they would identify funding and we could build something. So now they want to identify the transit projects. The rail projects are being developed in a separate list. So this is transit only, even though it is the Division of Transit and Rail. Michael Snow made the presentation to the Transportation Advisory Committee last Thursday, and yesterday I filled in for him at the Mobility Coordinating Committee here at PPACG. And there are two steps that they want to do in the next couple of months, and then have board recommendation or board recommendation in July, is to come up with an updated inventory of the projects. Now, what was in your packet and what I just handed out to you is the current inventory. And what I handed out has two additional projects at the bottom of the list that were not in your packet. Did everybody get an updated list? So this is the current inventory. There are some projects that CDOT has identified. You can see all but the last 2 or 3 projects are in our current 2040 long-range plan. I don't believe are limited to that. The updating this inventory is going to be an ongoing, continuous process forever. Periodically, based on what might be happening, they will come and ask us, PPACG, to update the priority. Has our priorities changed? We've added projects, we've completed projects, so they've dropped off the list. The inventory will be kept current as much as possible, but determining what our Tier 1 priorities are, that would be a periodic exercise. So this is a 2-step process that's going to be very rushed. MCC, the Mobility Coordinating Committee, and the Transportation Advisory Committee, the TAC, in the next couple of months will be developing identifying additional projects that should be in the inventory, and then coming up with a recommendation for the Tier 1 priority, and that will be coming through you before it goes to the board. Currently, statewide in their inventory, they have their larger projects, 250,000 or larger. They're identified in plans and studies, and they are primarily facilities, infrastructure, equipment, service expansions, not maintenance, not replacing vehicles, and planning. They started this process at least last year, if not earlier, but when they did so, it was for rural areas only. This time around, they are expanding it, so it's fully statewide, includes all the metropolitan areas. I see my backup is here, but it's Brian Vituli from MMT. So currently there's 215 projects that they've identified, $5.1 billion total cost. Not all of the projects have their cost identified, so when they finish developing the cost for some of those projects, the cost, the needs is going to be well over $5 billion. Just developing a wish list doesn't mean much. Then if somebody says we've got money available, what do you want to do? Well, we got this $5 billion wish list. What is that? What good does that do you? So after developing the inventory of $5+ billion, we'll be developing a recommended Tier 1, a smaller portion of those projects. Now, we did that with the road projects last year, and CDOT made that Tier 1 circle too small. And then I think it was the legislature, Senate Bill 267 came out and identified funding, and there was more funding than had been anticipated, so they immediately had to turn around and redo their Tier 1 prioritization process to account for the larger money. So Transit Division is hoping to learn from past experiences and develop a larger Tier 1 pot of projects so that they don't have to go back and redo the exercise. Just real quickly, what I need to emphasize is that there is no money for these projects. This is, if money fell from the sky, here's what CDOT would do. Now, that was the case last year with Senate Bill 267. The legislature finally approved some transportation funding. They're based on the formula. It was a bonding program, and there was $188 million for transit. And they had to make a decision in July. This year, the unknown is the Denver Chamber of Commerce and some businesses are developing a ballot initiative, a sales tax initiative, not going through the legislature. There are currently at least four versions of that initiative, and they all vary on how much of the tax is. Is it a 0.5% tax, 3/4, 1%? That type of thing, I think, is the primary difference. But using the 0.5% version, there would be $83 million a year for transit and multimodal, bicycle and pedestrian projects. And there's some information there on how the funding, one of the interesting things is it's a 50-50 match. If you're using federal funds,
That's high.
it's 80% federal, 20% local is the general match requirement. So this is certainly bringing in a lot more money, but it's increasing the local match requirement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I don't know what the deadline is. It's either in July or maybe it's August that the group has to determine which version they're using, has to get it submitted to the state so that the ballot issue can be approved and they get all of the signatures that are required so that it can actually be on the ballot in November. So if that comes to pass, it'll be a statewide sales tax
Increase.
issue, and they are attempting, or it is expected that they will have a list of projects in there, similar to our RTA list of projects. We've gone with the sales tax locally, and here's the projects that we want to fund with that. So they are developing this list, and that's why CDOT is rushing these transit projects identified so that they could also be, some of them could be included on the list. This is not a CDOT initiative. It's a private initiative, so what projects they decide to put on the ballot will be up to them. But obviously, they're going to have some discussions with CDOT, and they're going to want to make this a very appealing list of projects on a statewide basis if they want statewide approval. So even though it's a Denver Chamber of Commerce, theoretically, not all of the projects would be in Denver. So for the exercise that Michael Snow presented to us, we're estimating likely it's going to be a $2 billion Tier 1 project list. And for the PPACG area, right now we're just working with $170 to $200 million expected in our area. At this point, the formula for saying, okay, this initiative passed, we're going to get all of this money, how that money will be distributed around the state has not been approved. So we don't know exactly what we're going to get. But for our planning purposes and trying to get these transit projects identified and the needs identified and then the Tier 1 list, we're going to use 170 to 200 million for the Pikes Peak area. Now, these are going to be bonded projects, meaning that, so there's no performance. It's going to be fixed capital, no operating projects, program projects. And because they're going to be buying a bus and then bonding and paying back that bus for 20 years is not the most economical use of money. So more than likely, it will not be buying additional buses.
Yeah.
This was a real disappointment yesterday to the members of the Mobility Coordinating Committee, and because that's all their inventory is buses, you know, so that they can go around and pick up people. So, but for park and rides, new bus stations and offices and other similar type structures, it would make more sense. But this will be a CDOT decision ultimately in developing their list and what's on there. So we just started this discussion in this past week as to what projects are missing. The big handout, as I said earlier, this is what Michael Snow had pulled out of our 2040 regional plan. And then what I handed out today had 2 additional projects at the bottom of the list compared to what was in your packet. So that's what's been identified so far, and we're asking MCC members, the TAC members, anybody, non-traditional stakeholders, what do you think are the transit needs in the region? So if you've got some ideas, if you think something needs to be done, please let me know. And we'll gather all of those together and bring them back to the committees and provide them also to CDOT. And so that would be the updating of the inventory. And then we will work on identifying the Tier 1 projects. And at this point, we don't have a methodology identified as to how we're going to identify the Tier 1. One idea that was put out, if we've got projects that are in the 2040 plan and they've been identified needs and they've been developed through local processes, maybe those would be a Tier 1 compared to other projects that have not yet been included or addressed in a long-range plan. You know, there's some kind of a logical split. Whether it's the right one or not, we don't know yet. But so that we will also be working on over the next couple of months. So wanted to bring this to your attention just to get you familiar with it. And it'll be coming back to you at least in June, seeing what the other committees are recommending, and hopefully we've got enough time to get the 2 committees to coordinate and agree on a list, and then it'll be going to the board for approval in July.
Anybody have any questions for Ken? Yes, Hal.
In an ideal situation, will the distribution formulas be part of the initiative? In other words, will they be referenced as having been figured out? Do we know?
Ideally, I think As a taxpayer, I'd like to know that, but I've not seen the bills, and I don't know if it's going to be in the bill or whether that's something that CDOT will develop after. Do you remember, Brian, in that discussion at the TAC about how that distribution formula? I remember Michael saying that it hadn't been developed yet, but I don't remember who was developing it.
Good afternoon, Brian Vituli, City of Colorado Springs, Mountain Metro Transit. I believe in the next month or so, CDOT's Division of Transit and Rail has a Transit and Rail Advisory Committee, and they have a subcommittee who's going to be looking at the planning targets and the allocations. So that's still to come yet. So we haven't seen that.
Second question I would have is, it looks like the list of the projects that are on the larger sheet that you passed out, Ken, it looks like they're about 6% of the $5 billion. And I use $5 billion because that's the big, kind of the big number.
Mm-hmm.
What are the other 94% of the projects? I mean,
They're throughout the state, and I have not seen that list.
but are some of them like these mega billion-dollar rail projects that sound good but are not affordable?
No,
type
the
of a thing?
rail is in a separate project. The comment I made at the very beginning, the $5 billion, that is only transit. These are transit needs. And I don't believe that.
Because, I mean,
Is light rail, Denver's light rail program, is that included in transit?
Yeah.
Okay, so Denver's light rail as compared to commuter rail.
okay. Because based on what I understood the process to be, it sounds like an estimated amount of money was figured out and then projects developed that kind of fit that budget. Did everybody follow that process? Because to be 6% of the total wish list, per se, where we've got much more of a population and other kind of weight in the state, either we underestimated our projects or other people have overestimated theirs.
We haven't submitted our current list. This is what Michael pulled out of our 2040 long-range plan that was developed 4 years ago.
Okay.
And so that's what he's asking now. We need to update the inventory. What are the needs? And so he's doing that on a statewide basis.
Because, I mean, it's an enormous amount of money. It's being asked for a sales tax across the state. It certainly appears to be led out of the Denver metro area. There's in my opinion, there's some flashing red lights. So more than anything, just kind of understanding. I'm not proposing that we increase the size of our projects beyond what we think we need, just to try to capture more money. At the same time, asking for a sales tax that looks like the majority of the benefit would not come to El Paso County or PPACG areas, that's a concern. That's my opinion.
Right. So we just want to make sure in the first step that we've identified all of our needs, all of the current costs, so that the cost estimates are correct and brought up to today's cost and not 4 years ago, if that's the last time somebody looked at the cost. So your issues are very valid, and they are recognized certainly by CDOT, and I'm sure that the Chamber of Commerce has to make this an appealing list if they want statewide voter approval. So I don't know how they're going to distribute project list, when they put that together and to show benefits to everybody in the state.
Tim?
But all the projects have to be bondable, right?
This is a bonded funding source, yes.
So more or less, you're talking about capital projects.
Yes.
Buses or rail systems.
Not buses. It's not capital.
How about you? But I don't want to own a railroad. It's never good monopoly, so it's not.
So the Senate bill 267 process. I mean, those are bonded projects. So that's why they're asking for large capital projects, not operating, not vehicles. But the ballot initiative, and that's why you'll see, on this list there are some operating projects and there are some fixed route vehicle purchases. So, we were asked to put a list together that could fit both needs. So we don't know which way it's going, whether it's bonding with 267 or the ballot initiative. But, yeah, ballot initiative will be
Open
operating vehicles,
everything,
everything.
Does anybody, Sharon?
Yeah.
Brian was my backup note taker.
Okay.
And just, I know MCC was very concerned about the money as well, just like you are. And so just to muddy the picture, that it's unrelated to the list, the state is being sued for Senate Bill 267, and I don't remember the cause, but it's going to be tied up in courts, and money won't be available from 267 until it works its way through the court system, and it's not necessarily a speedy process.
Mm-hmm.
The other issue, the legislature this year that passed Senate Bill 267 last year now has a Senate Bill, is it 1? That is still being debated in the legislature up until May 9, when the legislature ends this year, where they would rescind Senate Bill 267 and take the money away if the ballot initiative passes. So
Yeah, but that's after the legislature.
So we don't know where. That's why this
Welcome to the
list
Capitol.
is a wish list. That if money ever falls from somewhere and actually lands on the ground and can be used, CDOT wants to be ready to have a list put together. So that's their intent. There is no promised money. We're not talking about that. We're
no
not
real
promised.
dollars.
No.
This is all everything, so.
Okay, I also would like to reiterate the Denver thing. It's coming out of Denver, and very frequently Denver gets the bulk of the money. To me, that is just a little bit frightening. We've had El Paso County commissioners in Denver fighting for us on somewhat of a regular basis. And the other thing is the 50% match. That's high. That's a high match.
Mm-hmm.
That's very high.
Very good. So watch for that and see what finally comes out and see what the initiative it is and study it carefully before you vote.
Okay.
Jim?
Just a comment, I have a problem with what our role is in this particular function at this particular time. You asked the question, do we know of any transit projects that need to go on the list? And frankly, Scarlett, I don't know, and I'm not sure where I'd go to get information about that, other than to call my friend Brian and ask him what's the latest and greatest that they would like to do. So I very much appreciate being informed about this. I don't know, boy, this is trying to deal with smoke and mirrors at some level.
No, I'm not asking for a CAC recommended list. Michael Snow made the comment that he will take input from anybody, phone call, email, talk to him in the hallway. He's looking for a current inventory from however he obtains that information. It will come back to the committee, and we will be asking for a recommendation for the PPACG priorities within our region. But to do a valid prioritization process, you need to know the fullest list possible.
Could we just add, Brian, could you come back up and just tell us how, from your point of view, since you are the king of the MMT, what does this list feel like? Does it feel like something that would work for you going forward, given your planning over the next 4 or 5 years?
Well, yeah, so the beginning part of what CDOT did with this list, at least for our region, you'll see, a majority of the projects here were pulled from the current 2040 RTP. And, you know, more comments that we need to get back to them. You know, that was 4 years ago. Some of these projects that are on this list, we have already had them funded through the TIP. So we're already either in design or we may already have them done. So some of these projects may fall off. As of now, our priorities would be Project T57. It's about 7 or 8 down from the top. That's our downtown transit station relocation. We updated that figure, you know, asking for $20 million total project cost. And then the bottom 3. So those are the 3 very, very recent comments that we gave to CDOT on some of what our priorities are. You know, we're looking to eventually transition to electric fixed route buses. You know, when our older buses reach their useful life and we go to replace them, we'd like to replace them with electric buses. We're going to leverage this, hopefully, with money that's coming out of the Volkswagen settlement later this year. So we'll be getting a lot of money for electric vehicles there. The Academy Hancock Transfer Center, that's part of a larger project. The city did a study a couple years ago, planning and environmental linkages study, kind of a preliminary NEPA process to look at how to reconfigure that Academy Hancock intersection. You know, removing the on and off ramps, opening up more land for redevelopment, and we're looking to have a piece of that to have a new transfer center that would replace our, what we call our super stop that's in that Academy Hancock area. And then, of course, fixed route service increases. You know, we have primarily, you know, really good daytime fixed route service, but when you get into the evenings and you get to Saturdays and Sundays, there's not as much service operating. You know, we would like to make the leap to have more operating hours out on the street. Hopefully that could draw more ridership because, you know, the majority of our riders are lower income, and a lot of those are working service sector jobs, retail jobs, and a lot of those do not, the hours are not, you know, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. during weekdays. They're during weekday evenings and Saturdays and Sundays. So those are our, you know, kind of our 4 priorities that we just provided to them as an update. But, you know, we expect to hear of some more projects from the MCC, especially if, you know, capital purchases or vehicles can be put on the list, because that's something that they generally do apply for grant funds from the state for, you know, replacement vehicles. So, but then, you know, what comes out of this list, you know, what makes it to the Tier 1 list will be a little bit smaller and tighter. So,
Thanks, Brady.
thank you.
Does anybody else? Yes, Julie?
Just on the funding need and funding total columns, the numbers appear to match, but the 2 bottom numbers don't. So we need to see like 9 or 9.
Yep, that's because there's $1 million already dedicated to the Woodman Park and Ride from the sale of the existing property.
Okay.
So that's why there's a mismatch in the totals.
That's not, oh, okay, I see it now. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ken. Okay, Jennifer, I think you're up next.
Nap time.
Yes. Some drama here.
Not a good thing. Where are we?
Okay, Jennifer Valentine. I'm a transportation planner with PPACG. So our UPWP, or Unified Planning Work Program, is basically PPACG's scope of work. So it describes the planning activities we expect to engage in over the next 2 years. So it is a document that has to be updated or actually redone every 2 years. But we also typically do what we call a mid-cycle update after about a year or so, and that's what this is. So it just gives us an opportunity to update any funding totals, add additional information from our member entities and things like that. So that's basically what we're doing here. So I'll just point out a couple of the more interesting changes that we made. There's minor changes throughout, formatting issues and things like that, but basically, okay, so we updated our air quality area map. And then one of these early tables we updated to reflect some rollover funding from last year. And other than that, I think it's relatively minor kind of formatting and typos and things. So just so you know what to expect over the next couple of months, this doesn't actually have to be approved for a couple of months now. We wanted to go ahead and bring it because it helps for CDOT to have an idea. They need to start basically getting everything in the works because their process, after they receive our scope of work, it takes them a few more months to incorporate it into the main scope of work. But so what we'd like to do is give our new transportation director an opportunity to take a look at this, weigh in on it, see if there's different directions that he would like to take. And so he arrives, if you don't already know, on May 14th. So he'll have a chance to look at it, and then we'll either bring it back to the committees in June or July, just depending on how quickly he can weigh in.
Bless you.
Any questions about, so at this point, this is just an information item.
Does anybody, go ahead.
Two comments. One, the work that you did on this and the corrections made it much easier to read.
Oh, good.
So I appreciate that. But that said, on page 35, where you had the Ruxton corridor studies, does that change any with the Broadmoor looking to, since we don't know what's going to happen with the COG Railway?
Okay, so part of this mid-cycle update was I reached out to all of our member governments for updated descriptions of the work that they're going to be doing over the next couple of years. Not to throw them under the bus, but I don't believe I received an update from Manitou Springs, so it's possible that that paragraph needs updating. So I'll make a note of that.
Okay.
Yeah, Tim.
Does the recently solved Banning Lewis Ranch issue affect this?
I don't think so because these are mostly planning studies. We don't have, it's not like every roadway or capital project that's going to be happening in our region. So I don't know that there are any planning studies for Banning Lewis coming out of the annexation agreement. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, yeah, but I thought, the radio advertisement I heard or whatever was like 108 or 180,000 people over the next so many years or whatever.
Right, so a lot of that is
somewhere. So.
Yeah, a lot of that's related to the small area forecast, which I'll be talking about next.
Yeah, about that very same thing.
Very good reading.
Okay, good.
But I guess the one thing I will say is, so there's the first 3 of the 7 planned villages in Banning Lewis Ranch are either being built or in the pipeline or already approved. And then we have the plan for the entire area. Of course, now it's outdated, but that's the information we had to put in. So it's possible that some of those changes will be reflected in the small area forecast in terms of the number of residential units and things out there. But I don't think it would really affect the UPWP. That it's a pretty general, just kind of scope of work for us.
Okay.
Jim?
You know how easily I am confused. You've been around me enough. I saw several references to spatial and tabular data. I think I know what they mean, but could you tell me what they mean when you were looking at them?
Okay, so those edits are not mine. So what I did was for I'm kicking
That's
the,
all right.
I'm kicking the can here. So I reached out to the people who are doing most of the work in that area. So I made a lot of the edits on the small area forecast piece or the long range plan piece, and I reached out to our GIS staff, and they made those edits and had specific wording that they really wanted to be in there. So I guess I'm not too concerned that that's not a public-friendly word, because it's not really a public, I mean, it's more of an internal document, but I can find out if there's a better way to say that.
Well, what I understood when I saw this, what I assumed and read into it was that spatial has to do with actual things like land requirements, and if you're talking about some things that you're looking at, and your maps for the next step are in that area. And then tabular, I think I understand that.
Because I would
Stuff that
assume
you would put on a table.
I would assume the spatial piece would be like maps and where does this attribute actually fall on a map to geolocate it?
Back down because I think you just hit it.
Yeah, versus just a spreadsheet exercise or the kind of spreadsheet behind the map.
Okay.
So
All right. Thank you.
that's the best I can do.
Hal?
Right at the very beginning, you said that there were two major updates. One was the air quality map. The other was the income.
Yeah, there was a table that
2
lists.
point something.
Yeah, it listed the funding amounts for the different years, and
What
Ken.
changed, or what was the major update per se?
So it was just updated with the rollover from the previous year. I don't know if you
At
want.
the table on page 9, figure 4.
Let's see.
Yeah, probably.
Because you spoke using the next page, which was 2.1, 2, 3, et cetera.
No, this is a table that was updated.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else have any questions for Jennifer on this? Okay, thank you. Jennifer, small area forecast, please.
Okay. Okay, I think I'm actually just going to start with, I put together a little presentation because some of this stuff can get a little bit technical, so I thought it might help to walk you through it this way. Oops. Come back. I am saying maximize. Okay, we'll just do it.
There you go.
Okay. All right, so I just wanted to start out with a just a very brief overview. I know a lot of you have been around for previous small area forecasts and have kind of heard me give the spiel a little bit earlier in the process, but others of you have not. So basically, the Colorado State Demographer's Office comes up with a projection or a forecast of how many people and how many jobs are going to be in every county throughout the state of Colorado. So that's why we do our small area forecast for the 2-county region instead of the MPO region, because we don't have a forecast for our MPO region. That's why it's a little bit different. So we take those control totals, and so all we know is that we're going to have, 1.1 million people in our region by 2045. So we have to figure out where are those people and jobs going to be. And so the real relationship for us to transportation and to all these transportation projects is getting people between where they live and where they want to go, between home and work, home and school, home and shopping. So that's really the basis. And so it's really our job and the job of the land use model, which we're using UrbanSim, to make that forecast. Okay, so my slide actually got a little bit messed up. This isn't the right slide, but I'll give you the verbal. So in terms of how it's used, so in previous years, we've needed to have one small area forecast, and that was related to air quality conformity. So at this point, we no longer have that same requirement, which is part of the reason that we had the flexibility to come up with 3 different land use scenarios as part of our scenario planning process. So we're doing things a little bit differently this time around. We're taking those 3 different land use scenarios and we're scoring all of our potential projects that might go into the long-range plan under all 3 of those scenarios. So we're trying to plan for, well, what if the world develops in this way, or what if it develops in this way, just to kind of be prepared for different possible futures. So the main place that comes into play is one of our scoring criteria was infill. And so basically we'll have a number of different boundaries, and you'll receive more or less points based on whether you fall within the 2010 census boundary, within the infill boundary, the new centers boundary, the dispersed. So that's really how it'll be used. And then we're also talking about other ways to use this information in the future to kind of provide additional value to our member governments, or their smaller studies that we can do moving forward. So this is where we're supposed to be. So just to give you a quick overview of the process, we did spend really more than just November and December, quite a bit of time just getting to know the model, since this is, UrbanSim is new, was new to us. We did a lot of testing. What's the impact of increasing zoning, or increasing floor area ratio, or coming up with a mask? So all different types of things to test the sensitivity of the model. So by February of this year, we were ready to start sharing some draft results. And so we met with land use planners from each of our different member entities. So this was a little bit different than how it had been done in previous plan cycles, where there was more of a committee approach. This time we reached out to individual member entities. So we spent a little bit of time incorporating feedback from them. It really varied quite a bit between the different meetings, but a lot of it was just entering additional development projects and tweaking the zoning and tweaking the masks. So then we also spent some time in March sharing the updated results with a small team of regional economic experts. We wanted to get the big picture view from them, and also really hone in on the methodology and assumptions that were in your packet, just to make sure that it looked good to them. So we incorporated their feedback, and then here we are, April 2018, where we are sharing results with TAC last week and you all this week. So next we're going to spend another month or 2 incorporating feedback we get from the committees. There's still a little bit of back and forth with the member entities, and then ultimately we're going to be looking for board approval in July, so we can be on the same timeline as the call for projects. Okay, so I want to give a quick review of the land use scenarios, because that's really the basis of what we're talking about with UrbanSim. So if you recall, we went through quite an involved public process last year with a workshop to develop these 3 land use scenarios. So in a sense, that was kind of the easy part. So we developed these scenarios in concept, but then we had the task of actually creating them in UrbanSim, in the land use model. And the way we did that was mostly through zoning, so what's the allowable underlying land use, and then we used something called masks, which I'll talk about. So the way we defined the 3 land use scenarios was, so infill is new development is concentrated in already developed areas. New centers, those already developed areas either remain or continue to grow, but we also see some new nodes of activity emerge. And then dispersed development is really kind of like the business as usual scenario. Okay, so zoning is a really important piece with UrbanSim. It's how we tell the model kind of the maximum allowable development, whether it's residential or commercial, in any given area. And our analysis is something called the TAZ, or Transportation Analysis Zone. It's just a way we carve up our region into little squares and shapes for analysis. So we use dwelling units per acre. So how many, is it a quarter acre lot, is it an acre lot? and then something called floor area ratio for different types of commercial and businesses in terms of how dense an area can be. So we developed these numbers by looking at existing zoning throughout the region, and then we also talked to our member governments and did some research about peer cities to try and figure out what would be appropriate. So just to be clear, these underlying values are the capacity, that's the maximum. So you might say that you can get up to 10 houses per acre in a specific area, but it's up to the model to decide if there's a market for that kind of density. So it might be allowed, but it might not be marketable. Okay, so we use zoning as one way to differentiate between or create the three different land use models. So really the quick version is we emphasized or allowed higher density development in downtown areas, high density residential, and mixed use in the infill scenario, which kind of makes sense. I mean, if you think about downtowns kind of continuing to grow. And then in the new center scenario, we allowed higher density development in high density residential, mixed use, and something called PUD, which is planned unit development, and that's a lot of large subdivisions are either zoned PUD before or during development, and so that's where we expect a lot of our new growth to occur. Okay, so the second piece was these masks we developed. So just telling the model you can put more people and jobs here doesn't mean it necessarily will. And so we didn't have three distinct scenarios just from the differences in zoning. So we came up with this mask concept. And so we came up with a mask for the infill scenario and one for the new centers scenario. So the dispersed development scenario doesn't have a mask. It's just what is current zoning? Let's just let the model run, basically. So with the infill scenario, we started out with incorporated areas. So I didn't want to sit down and draw a line on a map and say, this is our infill mask. So we wanted to start out with an established boundary. So for the new centers scenario, we used those same incorporated areas, but also added what are called census-designated places. So places like Calhan and Rama and Chipeta Park. I think Ellicott might be one. I think Falcon is one. And then we also added in those PUDs. So basically, the masks are encouraging the model to develop either in incorporated areas under the infill scenario or in incorporated areas, PUDs, and census-designated places under the new centers scenario. And I'll show you an example of these in a minute. Okay, so a little bit hard to see, but this is an example of one of the masks. So under infill, you can kind of see the stuff that looks clearer, you know, so the holes, there's Colorado Springs. You can see Woodland Park up here. But yeah, by and large, it's really just incorporated areas. And so the conversation we had with the TAC last week was that's not enough. So there are areas that aren't incorporated areas that are already seeing a lot of development, or there's already a lot of development on the ground. And we did define infill as new development occurs in already developed areas. So what we're going to be doing next is trying to figure out how we can systematically cut some additional holes in the infill mask. Okay, so I've already said a lot of this. So basically with new centers, we were trying to get the model to sort of spontaneously develop in new activity centers in places where there isn't already development. And it didn't want to do that because there are a lot of disincentives to doing that, you know, to growth that's not contiguous. There's infrastructure and other sort of cost issues. But like I said, we did include those census-designated places and PUDs to try and plant little seeds for places to start developing. And you can see it a little bit clearer here. So you can see some of the holes, you know, there's Woodland Park, but then this is the Chipeta Park that I was talking about, much bigger area, and, you know, you can see Falcon, and some of these are PUDs out in unincorporated El Paso County. So we had a lot of conversations with the member governments about, are these the right holes? Some of the PUDs were not ripe for development, and then there are other areas that are ripe for development that might not be a PUD. So still refining it. Okay, so this is more just an FYI. We put in almost 150 different development projects. So what's in the pipeline right now, what's been developed really in the last year or so, what's happening in the next 5 years. We really want to make sure that our current conditions in our first 5 years of the model are as accurate as they can be, because that's basically how the model extrapolates that information out into the future. And so I just received a few more development projects that I'm entering in today. So we do kind of have to draw the line somewhere and say no more projects, but obviously stuff is happening all the time. Okay, last couple of pieces are constraints and adjustments. So we do take into account things like floodplains and steep slopes, places that are not as attractive for development, and then different types of ownership. Maybe it's National Park Service or Forest Service land that's either not going to be developed or definitely not going to be developed at a high density. And then we really try to limit the use of adjustments to things like our military installations and I think also the Colorado Springs airport. So, for example, with the airport, we have 2 different TASs. One has the terminal and one has the runways and surrounding land. So we say, if you work at the airport, you work in the terminal, and none of the jobs are out on the runway. So that's just how we choose to contain it. And with the military installations, they grow based on government decisions, not based on the economy. I mean, maybe partially based on the economy, but we don't want the model to try and tell us what's going to happen on the military installations in the next 20 years. Okay, so the information that was included in your packet. So we chose to focus on density for this first round of results. So we looked at residential units or houses per acre and then jobs per acre. We started out experimenting with a lot of different ways to display the data, and of course we all know you can really lie or tell whatever story you want with the data, but we were trying to be as neutral as possible. There were some instances where maybe you would go from 1 job to 2 jobs, and that TAS would show up as bright red because it doubled. Or you would go from 2,100 jobs to 2,500 jobs, and it would look like a big increase, but it was really a small percentage. So we had to play around with how to kind of display the data in a neutral manner. But yeah, so basically you have the 3 different land use scenarios, and then we've shown the 50% mask and the 100% mask for the infill and new centers scenarios, and that's really a policy piece that still has to be worked out. So if we were to apply the 100% mask, that's basically saying only what's on the ground right now or what's in the pipeline is going to develop under the mask, so under those crosshatch areas. So essentially that's kind of like establishing growth boundary. So our intention wasn't necessarily for that to be our scenario. It's just we did a 0, a 25, a 50, a 75, a 100, just to kind of see what everything looked like. So the 50% is kind of that middle ground, and you can see it doesn't make a huge impact, but it does make an impact, and you can see the colors and the squares and things changing on the map. So I guess if you all have specific comments about, this TAS or that TAS or whatever, I can take those, but really I'm interested in hearing what would be useful for you to see in the future. Is there a better way to display the data in terms of maybe comparing a way for you to easily see 2015 versus 2045, or what's the percent change, or what's the number change in a given zone?
Go ahead.
Jennifer, when you develop, the pieces for the model, or address different components of the models, do you take into account historical growth rates? Because I notice that when I've done planning before is that, we come up with these models of what we'd like to see happen. And then when I was building hospitals, but one of the things I noticed was that it may not have referenced enough about what had happened in the past that gave us some indication about not how much growth, but the pattern.
Right.
So I guess I was curious as to how you use past information based on different economic up and down turns and built that into the model.
Yeah, so there's a couple things we're doing to try and incorporate that. The first isn't directly related, but so our base year data is 2015. And so we try to make up the lag between 2015 and today. So I entered in a whole bunch of development projects that got completed in 2017 or 2016 because we wanted to make sure, well, if it's on the ground now, it needs to be in the model somewhere, right? But the other piece is, so our base year is 2015, but the model is calibrated back to 2011. So it first does a run between 2011 and 2015 to kind of look at the trajectory of different things. I mean, ideally, I guess it could go back further than that, but that's sort of the standard for its calibration. I think sort of a post-processing exercise, we're interested, too, in seeing how this forecast compares to the last one. Of course, it's going to be a little difficult because we're using a different tool and there's a lot of different inputs. But in terms of the model itself, yeah, it just has that calibration period.
Does the model build in historic downturns and upturns in the economy that influence development patterns?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think so. It has a location choice model, and so it works a little bit differently on the household side versus the non-residential side. And so really, I think it looks at pretty recent market transactions. I mean, we have a data set from a company called CoStar that looks at rents and land values and things like that. So, I mean, I guess the current state of a property is probably a reflection of recent history, but no, we wouldn't get all those sort of swings. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Kevin?
I have a couple of questions. On the table on page 3, there's these areas that are located in that table, and you've got downtown or CBD as one, and downtown COS again. Is that what's happening there?
Right. Okay. So the last two categories, so downtown COS and Manitou Gateway mixed use, were sort of late additions. So initially, what I had to do was try to mesh the zoning classifications for all of our member governments, which, as you can imagine, there's a lot higher density in a place like Colorado Springs or Manitou Springs than in lots of, unincorporated El Paso County. And so it really kind of ended up being a little bit of an average. And what we found was that some of the numbers, some of the density that we're already seeing, some of the really big apartment projects that you're already seeing in downtown Colorado Springs right now, I mean, they're looking at 120, 150 dwelling units per acre because it's a, 300-unit apartment complex on half an acre or, whatever the numbers are. And so we weren't getting a realistic picture of how downtown Colorado Springs might develop, especially in the infill scenario. So we wanted to at least allow the model to do some really high-density development there if there was the market for it. So we didn't want to artificially limit it because, it was averaged with El Paso County and Fountain and Monument. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm curious, though, if they're additive. Downtown or CBD is the same as downtown COS. So if we've got 15 once and 60 again, how is that operating?
No. So this is correlated to a zoning shapefile that goes in the model. So you're only zoned as one thing. So a parcel in downtown Colorado Springs, if it's in their downtown, it would be downtown Colorado Springs. It would not be captured under the general downtown or CBD. That just refers to all the other downtowns. So it's not additive. You're
There are-
only
there are
one
other
thing on
downtowns?
this table.
So like Manitou downtown? Is that what
Or
you're-
monument or fountain or?
Right. So you're only zoned as, a
That's
parcel is only zoned as one thing.
Okay, all right. I have another quick sort of observation. This issue about allowed zoning or allowed density, but not marketable. People make and lose millions of dollars trying to figure that out. And I'm astonished that a computer program can try that, but I'm very curious to watch it. And then along the lines of what Jen has said in the past, these things are all very esoteric when you're talking about them with words, but when you see the map and you see what it says, and there's this big blob out in Ellicott, and you go, that ain't going to happen, or that doesn't make any sense to me. What is going on with that? When will we get those kind of opportunities to apply the common sense, Jen's common sense, test to these things?
It's the common sense mask.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The common sense mask. That's a good one. Yeah. I find it very difficult to look at these numbers and try to figure that out. But I can tell you, if I look at the map, I'm going to be able to tell you what I think doesn't make any sense to me and what does. Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing, going back to the whole conversation about do you show density, do you show numbers or percentages, each one looks very, very different. And we like using density because it accounts for the fact that some TASs are really big and some are really small. I mean, you have that denominator of the size. But it kind of fools people a little bit, like some people have looked at Schriever Air Force Base, for example, and said, no, there's, 6,000 jobs out there, or whatever the number is. And we say, yeah, but it's also however many acres. And so when it gets divided, it's still very low density. So I think what we'll ultimately do is just show all three. And then you can see, this TAS gained 100 jobs, and that was 4%, and that means four jobs per acre. So you'll have all three, I think, is what we'll probably do next time.
Great. Thank you.
Jim?
Kind of piggybacking off of something that Kevin just said, but what is the value and utility of the small area forecast? Is it used to identify pertinent and weigh projects that are being proposed as to how they are supporting something? And the second implied thing on that is, what is its influence on policy? Where does anybody get involved in taking this and going and saying, all right, what do you want to do? Do you want to support infill? Do you want us to be putting more value on those infill projects, or what? So can you help me with that?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about that at the beginning. So the concrete way it's being used this time is in scoring. So when we get to the infill criterion, when we're going through, we're looking at a specific project, and we'll say, does this project perform better under the infill scenario, or does it perform better under the dispersed development scenario? So there might be a project that's more needed or more useful under one scenario than another. The fact that we're scoring projects under all three kind of means that there's something for everyone. So you might score really well under one scenario but not the other two. And then, of course, you also have 11 other scoring criteria. But it does factor in. So you will receive more or fewer points based on where you're located and the utility of the project.
Do policymakers see this? Do the people, because, obviously infill has a certain degree of influence on budgets and city needs and things like that. Conversely, each of these, having worked on this 4 years ago or whatever, each of these does drive its own needs. The discussion about Banning Lewis is a good example of how that discussion flows. So I'm just I'd love to see us not be an esoteric thing. I'd love to see it be a tool of some value in the PPACG process and perhaps outside.
Yeah, so the intention is to do some post-processing where we compare the three scenarios and maybe even do a little fact sheet. I have one in mind where you say, we're not choosing a preferred scenario, but you can say this scenario performs better in terms of infrastructure costs or stormwater or greenhouse gas emissions or whatever it is you want to compare, and then people can kind of judge for themselves whether infill is better or worse than dispersed. I mean, of course, a lot of these conversations are just personal preference, like do you want to live on a big lot or a small lot? But there are we can measure to kind of compare the impacts of developing in different ways. And so that's how we're hoping it'll be used, that, of course, PPACG has no impact over how the City of Colorado Springs or El Paso County or anyone else chooses to develop. All we can do is present it and say, kind of here are the facts of the ramifications of different types of development styles.
Well, just a final comment for me, and that is, since we went through the exercise last month and going through the priorities of the criteria, I think it would be very interesting, and you've already suggested you want to do this, so I'll encourage you to do one of those cross-references as to how these three scenarios actually interact with the criteria. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, and just had a thought that maybe when we're starting to think about putting that together, we'll come to you and or the TAC and just talk about what kinds of things you want to see compared. I mean, they should be at least loosely based on the weighting, because obviously those are the things that are important in some way, but we can talk more about the fact sheet when we get there.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Tim?
A couple of things. I'd like to get a soft copy of the PowerPoint, number one, if that's
Okay.
possible.
Mhm.
Send that out.
Good to share.
The second question is, was Benning Lewis included modeling at all, or?
Yes, so we have, and that's what I talked about in my segue. So we did get the plan for the whole 7 villages from Oakwood, and so basically for each village they sketch out, we're going to have this many homes, so we need a school, so the school's going to be here, and we're going to have this many apartments and this many houses, and it's probably a little bit rough, but for a model like this, it's pretty good. And so when you enter in the development projects, you can do it block by block, or you can do it sort of at the TAS level, but you go in and say, we have this plan that says there's going to be 700 homes here, and they're going to be about 2,500 square feet each. And so we put in that kind of information, so the model incorporates that into either the base year or 2020 or whenever that development is going to be on the ground.
And last comment, request, for a relatively new person, I'd really like to have a lexicon because there's all kinds of initials running around here. It's like being in the military almost. So.
I thought they had one at the back.
Yeah.
There is one in the back. It's on the back.
Well, there's a
One of
lexicon
these.
in one of the presentations.
Yeah.
Not this one.
Yeah, there was.
But there's like a global acronym list that
Oh,
we
there
have
is?
for the whole,
Yeah.
if you don't
Yeah.
have it,
Yeah,
I'm sure Jessica would be happy to make sure we can.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'll
Yeah.
just send it out to everybody,
But
but also do
updated.
a specific one for.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's very valid.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's
And
very valid,
It's
yeah.
good to update it.
Yeah.
Kevin, and then Aubrey?
Okay, I have one more, yeah. And this is what Jim reminded me of this. I have thought that when you use the small area thing, the small area, what was it? Forecast. That you're actually generating traffic out of that, and that the model, or the next model, or some model is going to say, and if you grow this way, you're gonna have a gigantic mess at Austin Bluffs and Union. If you grow and that will cost you $48 million to fix. And if you go the other way, you won't have a mess at Austin Bluffs and Union. You'll have a mess at Woodman and Meridian. And that will cost you $12 million, but the expansion of Powers and the expansion of Meridian in order to get out there will cost you $178 million. And I'm just throwing numbers and stuff, but will there be something like that where where when you start this comparison thing, you can't just go with every project. You got to identify different projects under different scenarios. Is that what's going to happen?
Yeah, so we've always gone through a process where the land use model and the travel demand model talk to each other. So you typically go back and forth every 5 years. And so first I take the output for 2020 and I give it to Ken. And he puts it in the travel model. He puts in things like, the number of people and the number of jobs and income categories and things like that. And then what his model spits out is the travel time between different zones. And so we've always done that, but now we have to do it 3 times because we're doing it for each scenario.
The bigger computers.
More computers, yeah. So there's definitely
smaller computers, just faster computers.
Yeah, smaller.
So there's definitely a chance that we will see a difference between those 3 scenarios in terms of the differences in the travel time between zones, depending on how things develop. And as you go along, they're influencing each other. So if it's a longer travel time between zones as you go along, maybe development will be less likely in a specific area or vice versa. And I'm informing the travel model. There are a lot of people here. Maybe eventually we're going to need a road. So there is that coordination.
So I mean, the whiz kids on the TAC will be able to say, then we're going to need to add 12 lanes to Powers Boulevard, or in order to do that, and it's going to cost us this much. Does that happen?
I don't think that's part of the current plan.
So there's no whiz kid thing.
Okay.
There he is.
Yeah, there's.
I'm no whiz kid, but your concept is correct. We work the travel demand model and the socioeconomic model work back and forth to show that interrelationship. Banning Lewis just got approved. If nobody builds a road in Banning Lewis, there'll be no houses built. So there is an interrelationship, and which one is the chicken and which one is the egg, there is that issue. But we're trying to get this information out under the 3 scenarios so that the county, the cities, Manitou, Monument can look at this and we'll show the congested roads under each scenario. Say, if the population grows under these 3 scenarios and there's no new roads built, where is the problem? Yes, it is at Austin Bluffs and Powers, or it is out at Meridian. Under this scenario, it's not. And that's where we try to get that information out to the local entities. They say, this intersection was only a problem in 1 scenario, or it was a problem in all 3 scenarios. So if you're trying to decide with a limited amount of money, which project should you ask money for, well, if there's only a 1/3 chance of this intersection being a problem, and there's a 100% chance for this intersection B to be a problem, then maybe they would submit that intersection B and request money for it. Obviously, there's an infinite number of futures, and we just tried to pick 3 that were representative, that were reasonable, and to look at what's kind of an exposure, risk exposure type thing. If our scenarios are reasonable, then this project would do well to serve all 3 scenarios, or it would only serve 1. But the entities will submit their projects and request for the money, and this will be part of their input in making that decision.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. Aubrey first and then Tamara.
So this is a bit over my head. I hope I'm not the only one. And I had the same question as Jim, sort of the practical application. So for Banning Lewis, because that's fresh on our minds, right? Was the current small area forecast used in any way in that decision making, do you think, or would it only be used now for transportation projects that will be applied in Banning Lewis, or how does that work?
So I think the last time the small area forecast was done, Banning Lewis was still being it wasn't really opened up for development. It was still kind of oil and gas. So I don't think the last small area forecast really showed much of anything going on out there. It's really just been in the last few years that all of this has happened. And so the whole forecast is really an iterative process as we go along, but also from forecast to forecast. And so, hopefully we'll continue to use UrbanSim, and so our inputs will be consistent, and we can say this time we know more about what's happening in Banning Lewis Ranch, and we can add in these 6 new development projects. So at this point, we're always just using the most current, best information we have. And like I said, we do, at some point, we have to draw the line and say, this is current as of, April 25th, 2018. So. Thanks.
I think Jennifer, you asked this earlier, what information you could provide that better help us to understand. And I'd like to go into a couple of ideas.
Yeah, please.
It sounds like this model, you input in a lot of criteria and boundaries and assumptions. Including the latest data is from 2015. I think it would be helpful if each scenario presented, you tell us kind of key assumptions that you've made and key data that you're using to create that model scenario. Because I think that would kind of give us perspective of what you are thinking, what you are thinking as planners, because my guess is that you run the model kind of initially, right? And then you realize, oh, this is not really reflecting what's actually going on in real life. And so then you use your judgment to tweak the models so they kind of portrays more of what you see currently and what you expect within your judgment. That's something that none of us will have a good concept of, so I think it'd be very helpful to provide some of those bulleted items of those key assumptions. And it certainly would help me, because then I'll know this scenario, Jennifer thought this process. So that would help me be able to compare the 3 different scenarios. And then another item would be, when I look at that map, I grew up here and I lived here for a long time, and I have no idea where things are.
Yeah.
So I think maybe some of the key, either major roadways, or even just pointing out where Woodland Park is. Exactly, just so that we know, so then I know where that yellow spot is, that off Mark Shuffle and Wood, and that kind of information I think would be very helpful to those of us who are trying to use this information as part of a scoring criteria that we're trying to use. So we're trying to take this information and really use it up, apply it to the decision that we're going to make on different projects that are coming out. Is that somewhat fair? Is that doable?
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. So a couple of things. The first thing you requested already exists, because I keep a very meticulous log of the inputs and assumptions for each. We have 168 model runs already, so I need to know what happened in each one. And in terms of the landmarks and such, we can definitely do that. Things get a little bit busy on the maps with the crosshatches, but I totally agree. I don't know where all the roads are and everything either. Obviously the KMZ, you have everything there, but in terms of the static map, it needs to be usable too, so we'll see what we can add to those.
I mean, if you're providing that in a PDF in a report, you can just take a PDF and just write in the PDF, or I don't know if
Yeah.
Bluebeam or something like that will actually let you manipulate your PDF and draw in
Sure.
pretty much anything you want.
Yep, we can do that.
You should ask your boss for Bluebeam. I think you'll like that.
I can edit PDF, so I'm good.
Jennifer, what's the relationship of this exercise with the workshop that we had like about a year ago or so, where we had these big cards around? Was that the starting point for some of this discussion?
Pretty much, yeah. So that was, I think you're talking about the scenario planning workshop. Yeah. So we started out with all those contributing factors. We talked about autonomous vehicles and things like that. So that was basically the storyline that informed each of these scenarios. We went out to the public, the farmers markets, and all of that stuff. And so if you recall, we brought all of that through the committees and the board, had those conceptually approved by the committees and the board, and then, like I said, had the task of actually making those appear in the land use model. So then what we'll do kind of after that, as part of the long-range plan itself, is bring that storyline back in. Because, you know, honestly, whether people think autonomous vehicles are an important part of the infill scenario, that's great for the big picture and for the storyline. But in terms of what I actually do in Urban Sim, it doesn't necessarily matter if autonomous vehicles or millennials are causing something to happen. So.
Okay.
Anybody have anything else for Jennifer?
Who comes to you to get this information?
So that's kind of an ongoing conversation we're having. We have a lot more capability with this program, with this model, than we did with what we used in the past. And so we've been looking at what a lot of other MPOs and communities are able to do with it. They can look at smaller areas. They can look at, you can identify a commute shed and say, you know, what's the age demographic in this commute shed, or what kinds of jobs are here. So there's a lot of output about, you know, job sectors and ages and income levels. So we could dig in a lot deeper and do more. So at this point, nobody comes to us and says, hey, Jennifer, can you do a commute shed for Manitou Springs? But if that's something we decide we want to make available, we might start offering that to people.
What I'm saying is, if you put this in a format that laymen can understand, and you don't have an engineering degree to figure it out, anybody can do it. There's all kinds of use for this for a developer that wants to go into an area. What's the transportation impact going to be? If I put in this density, if I put in this shopping center, if I pull this little strip mall, what's the overall impact, and how is that growing, and what are my chances of this being successful based on what you project is going to take place, but done in a simplified form that a developer or somebody that's going to do that can understand it.
Yeah, I mean, we do have people come to us and ask for output from the travel model. So can you tell us what this intersection is expected to look like in the next 10 or 20 years or whatever? So things like that. The piece with Urban Sim and with the land use model, we'll have to think about that, I think.
I think it's great information, but you got to put it in such a way you advertise that people know it's available and to be able to use you. I think it's a great idea.
All right. Thanks, John. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I appreciate it. All right, Ken, you're up again.
Take you to your item.
We need to group your stuff together.
He was Michael Snow first.
Well, that's true.
Yeah,
He's been schizophrenic today.
Yeah, many hats.
Ken Prather again. This is an information item that is going to be an active item for the next 5 months. Transportation law, both the MAP 21 and the current law, the FAST Act, are moving transportation planning towards performance-based planning. Develop a performance measure, develop a target for that performance measure, develop a reporting system, and report on how well you achieved your targets over time. Last year, you remember you were involved in developing the targets for our long-range plan, and we've got 13 of them. The federal system has targets on safety, basically maintenance, and system performance, system reliability, and reduction in emissions, air quality pollutant emissions. And they have deadlines that the state has to establish them, and then we have to establish them 6 months after the state does. Last year, FHWA established a safety target. The state, CDOT, established its safety target, and we had to also adopt one, and we said we would use the state's safety target, and we adopted that as part of our overall targets back in September of last year. This year, the state must identify its maintenance targets, pavement and bridge conditions, and the system performance targets by May 20th. This is a presentation made in March, at the end of March. The Transportation Commission just met last Thursday, and I haven't heard. So these were proposed targets, but fully expect the Transportation Commission to approve them for the state, and they have to be approved no later than May 20th, which then makes our targets 6 months later, November 15th. We have to have the PPACG targets. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail today, but just wanted to introduce the concept because we will start talking about this now. How do the targets that we developed last year and approved, how do they relate to these three? Do our targets meet the requirements of these targets, or do we have to develop some additional ones? So we'll be going through that, and I'm just going to try to identify some of the highlights as to what the targets are. We are using this IRI, the International Roughness Index. That's what we're using in our performance measure. That's what the federal requirement, and it looks like state is also going to use. There's their proposed targets. Key thing in here is you need good or poor pavement on the interstate system, good or poor pavement on the NHS, which is the National Highway System roads. Interstates are part of the National Highway System, but there is a separate target for interstates, then a separate target for other National Highway System roads. So good and fair pavement conditions for those roads. For bridges, they are using, again, bridges on National Highway System, and they're using the deck area. So you've got so many square feet of the total deck area in the state or in the PPACG region. That's good, or that's poor. And what's the current situation, and what's the goal? You can kind of see here with that green bar that looks like right now 48.8% are good, and if the purple bar is the goal, looks like CDOT's willing to drop a little bit. Rather than climbing, they're willing to set a lower goal than what's there right now.
I'm just trying to understand, forgive me. So what's on the red is actual, current actual?
Yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, the colored
The red
bars,
over
green,
and the
yellow, those are the actual
Okay.
results. For now, these are for CDOT statewide on their facilities.
Okay.
So we have to identify, develop the data for what's in our region, and then decide, do we also want this purple bar to be our goal? Do we want it to be higher? How do we set a higher bar than CDOT when you consider that 80% of the bridges in the area are CDOT bridges, or whatever the number is? But
Pretty high.
all of the bridges on a CDOT road are obviously CDOT bridges, but these are also NHS bridges, and there are a lot of NHS roads that are not CDOT roads.
Such as?
Woodman Road is an NHS road. And Fillmore is, or used to be. So a couple of years ago, we went through a process statewide, and all of the NHS routes were reviewed, and they're identified in our 2040 plan, but I honestly don't remember them. So this is what we have to develop, and in a cooperation with the state. It's not that we can override the state. We can't force them to do something. Reliability, this gets into performance measurement, the system performance. Getting from here to Denver on I-25. If you can get there in an hour every time you take the trip, that would be great. It's fast. It's fast, and you know it's going to take an hour. Now, if it's going to take you 3 hours every time, it's not so fast, but it's still reliable. You know it's going to take 3 hours. If you need to get to a doctor's appointment, if you need to get that airplane, you got to leave here 3 hours early. Now, when a road is unreliable, you don't know if it's going to take you an hour and a half, an hour and 15, an hour and 45, 2.5.
Or 3.
Or 3, or you just never know. So you don't know how far in advance you have to leave to guarantee getting to where you want to be on time. So this is not so much a measurement of speed, but it's a measurement of how reliable is that trip? How reliable, how sure are you as to how long your trip's going to take? And so it's on interstate travel and non-interstate travel. Then there's one also for freight. And there's slightly different formulas down there in different time periods. But these are the performance measures that are required by law that we have to address.
Do they set goals for those? Have they set goals for those?
CDOT has. I think the goal here is right at where it currently exists. We haven't set ours. So there's the statewide summary. This is by year, 2011 out to 2016. And there's a reliability index as it's calculated. Kind of maybe that's a downward trend. Purple line is the goal, as to what CDOT has set as its goal. Now, there's a difference in these. Pardon?
And it's better when it's below.
Right. For that, you want it to be closer to 1, the better.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, the safety target has to be reported every year, and you can review it and change it every year. The maintenance targets, the bridge and the road condition, that's a 4-year target, a 2-year and a 4-year target that has to be developed, and you can change and revise it after 2 years. So each one has a slightly different time period. This I'm going to skip over because it's for Denver only, because they're special. They've got an extra target that they have to develop and meet that we don't have to. But for areas that are receiving CMAQ funds, congestion mitigation and air quality, and in our area, those are projects that will reduce the amount of carbon monoxide. It can reduce ozone, it can benefit congestion, it can do other things, but it must reduce carbon monoxide. Our last project that uses those funds is in 2019. So I'm not sure, and this is part of what we're going to be talking to the feds about, if we're developing a long-range plan that's going to be the first year is going to be 2020, do we need to develop a target for CMAQ? We might not have to. That's my hope. Unfortunately, when you're no longer eligible, this is because we become an attainment area for carbon monoxide after 20 years. That when we are redesignated by EPA as an attainment area, we are no longer eligible for CMAQ funds, and so we won't get them anymore. So there's a reduced funding as a consequence. So anyway, this is each project that's funded by the CMAQ funds gets evaluated as to how much of these pollutants it's reducing, and you have a goal that you're trying to reduce these pollutants by so much, and then you go back and you evaluate it and see with the projects that you're selecting in your plan and in your TIP, are they achieving your emission reduction goals? So that's kind of a real brief introduction. I thought the rest of the material that CDOT presented there, if you read through it, answers a lot of the questions and shows some of the more detailed calculations that we'll be getting into later. The key for us is this November 15th deadline. So if we can get through this process, maybe get the board to approve it in October, November 15th, I think, would be just a day or two after the board meeting in November, but people are starting to think about Thanksgiving and other things at that time period, so maybe we can get it done where we're only worrying about Halloween, and so that's kind of my goal, is to try to have this all finished in October.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Ken. Questions?
John had his hand up.
Yeah, just a clarifying question. So the targets that PPACG has to set are for all roads in our region that are not CDOT or NHS? Because they have their own targets?
No, the targets that we developed last year would apply. The targets we adopted apply to the transportation system.
Which includes those.
So that would include state roads, private roads, local roads. Now, we don't have any authority over private roads. PPACG doesn't have any authority over local roads. So it's how we influence our member entities, how we influence CDOT, and they are a very cooperative partner with us. They come to us and say, what do you need? What's your priorities? What do you want done? And we would look at it and say, well, here's our goals. We would rather have Project A over Project B because our goals would be better met with this project. So we have that discussion, and that we have that discussion with our member entities as well. Getting back to your concept, Kevin, of we develop all this information and we get it to the member entities and we try to get the best projects brought forward.
So do our targets have to be at or better than CDOT's? They can't be worse, right?
I was under the concept that the feds set a target and the states had to be better or equal, and then we had to come along and we had to be better or equal. And I made that a week ago or at a meeting, and I was kind of shot down. So I have to go back and revisit it. It kind of gets back to my concept. How do we set a target that's higher than CDOT if a large percentage of CDOT or of roads or bridges in our area are CDOT? And so how do we set something if we have no directive authority for them, and they're looking at a statewide target where we're only looking at a regional target. So that's part of the conversation that has to continue.
Yeah.
John?
You're talking about reliability for the road, and we have that here. I just try to get in I-25 north about 5:30. But if everybody leaves 3 hours early to get to Denver, then we have a congestion 3 hours early. But I mean, there's got to be some way to mitigate that, and I don't know how you guys, or how we work with CDOT or the the federal government for the non-interstate highways and the interstate to come up with solutions. Larger cities, well, you have got to stop, and they try to space out the traffic going in and do that. But the answer is how to mitigate that so it doesn't be unreliable all the time. What do we do for that?
Well, that's where the traffic engineers, civil engineers do a lot of that's where their expertise comes in. Okay, the interstate is, even here in town, 5:30 is backed up when it's not backed up at noon. Some days at 5 o'clock is worse than others. So they're evaluating different strategies. Do you add a lane? Do you put in meters, the stoplights on the ramps, and so people enter in at a slower rate, and fill in the gaps rather than slowing down the traffic on the interstate without backing up and completely blocking Colorado or Fillmore or Woodman because they're backed up waiting to get on the interstate. So they look at those type of things. What can you do with traffic signal timing, widening, eliminating curves, how much, what's causing, they try to identify what's causing the bottlenecks and then figure out the best way to solve it without just moving it down the road to, a mile to the next location.
That would go in conjunction with Plan C was talking about projecting that because that's causing those gas to backs up the interstate. The whole thing is the whole picture not on federal of what's happening on the local levels.
And that's something that I've heard the CDOT engineers talk about, that they could do something, but 5 years from now, they'd have to rip it out and replace it with something else because of the growth that what would work today and solve the problem wouldn't work with the increased traffic that's going to come, and they know it's going to come. So then what do you do? Do you do something now that's going to get thrown away, or do you save up some additional money to do the larger project that's going to be needed 5 years later, but we don't have the money for it today? So it's that, exactly, I mean, that's what they're trying to do, and it's not easy.
Tim?
Yeah. Is there any update on the ransomware thing?
On the what?
Ransomware thing?
I think they are almost back up completely. But they are, because of it, they are significantly behind in their work and contracting and things like that you wouldn't think would have been impacted, but it had a significant impact.
Ken, I have a couple of questions, and I'll be happy to take them offline and meet with you because they have to do with the process.
I'm available.
Trying to understand on the structure and pavement questions, how much is subjective versus objective? And even looking through the stuff from CDOT and from Washington, I was not entirely convinced I understood, on that side of it.
Okay.
And then the other question I had is on the transportation reliability. Where did they measure it in seconds? Because the calculation that's in there is in seconds, and we were just talking about an hour to Denver, and I'd be interested in how that is arrived at. So,
okay. We did last year, the City of Colorado Springs paid over $1 million to do a survey of all of its roads for the International Roughness Index, and this is where the vehicle goes along with very sophisticated springs and lasers, and it gets the jiggle, and too many jiggles per 100 yards or per mile, it is a worse condition. PPACG paid for the other roads, the major roads outside of the city that are within our MPO area. So we have current IRI data for the roughness pavement condition. The speeds and the times on the roads for the reliability will come from, I think, a company that CDOT has contracted with called INRIX that we've had access to for a couple of years now. And it measures every one of your cell phones and GPS locators in your laptops and your iPads and in your car. And as you're driving along, it can calculate how long it takes you to get from here to there, and therefore what your speed is. And it reports this out to anybody that wants to buy their subscription.
Yeah, we feel real secure now.
Your individual stuff is not identified, but we can go there.
Okay.
We can go there and say, okay, give me the average speed or the congestion for every Wednesday of the last year or the last month or every day or at. I think it's down to, I know it goes down to 5-minute intervals. I think some of their stuff goes down to 1-minute intervals. But that's what we're starting to use. All right.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Member announcements. Does anybody have anything they'd like to bring up?
I do need to make sure you guys all know the new PPACG Area Agency on Aging Yellow Book came out the 2 Fridays ago. So if you are interested in helping make sure that word gets out to your community and the folks that you represent, please stop by the front desk downstairs and grab a copy or 12 to take with you. And then this will be the very last CAC meeting where we are on these wireless microphones. We'll be
Nice.
switching to wired ones so that we no longer have to have a concern about feedback that seems to happen when cell phones end up on the tables, particularly if you've ever been to one of our board meetings where that is an incredibly frequent problem. So those were my two things.
Thank you, Jessica. Anybody have anything else? Okay, how about items for the next CAC meeting? One thing, did we reschedule Hyperloop?
We indeed tried to, and they have been non-responsive. So
Awesome.
at this point, we are sadly waiting for them to reach out again.
Okay, cool. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to see on the agenda? Jen?
No. Justin, do we have any legislative updates this time?
Since our last CAC meeting, there have been no new bills the PPACG Legislative Committee has suggested taking a position on.
Okay.
We have ongoing movement with Senate Bill 1, which, as got mentioned earlier, relates to transportation funding, but it's not currently in a position where anything is happening with it. Legislative session ends May 9th, so I will most likely be sending out a wrap-up to everyone the week after, letting you know what was accomplished, what didn't happen, so that we all know where things moved. But at this point, didn't is the more likely response.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they'd like to add? I just want to say thanks to Jim for filling in during tax season. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking care of everybody's taxes.
It wasn't everybody's, it just felt like it. Okay, meeting schedule is attached. Other than that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are you going to miss your little friend?
Once I can get rid of the scooters, I'm going to wish I could burn them. Because I hate those a lot more than I hate this. But I'm going to be on them longer because I get the boot next.
You get the boot, yeah.
Crutches.
Yeah, it will, yeah.
Not
probably.
just in my life would be a great joy.
It's amazing how you appreciate
Little things.
normality.
Drive myself. Like that one's the one that right now I'm like, I'm dependent on my husband and my daughter, and I don't know the schedule is
On Wednesday morning. You sure? Because I'm like,
Bruce, right?